Okay, so I mentioned this before the break. Let's get now to the full embarrassment that was Donald Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, on Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace yesterday. This will be something different. We're going to look in detail at an interview. And there is so much to learn from this interview that Chris Wallace did with Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney. I already played for you the short clip in another story of Mick Mulvaney claiming that even though Donald Trump is the president of the United States, that's just one of his gigs, effectively, that Trump still considers himself to be in the hospitality industry. So we won't go back over that. That's ridiculous enough. What was actually far more embarrassing was the way in which Mick Mulvaney came completely unglued, trying to deny directly to Chris Wallace's face, having said things that are on video, which Chris Wallace was prepared for and threw right back at in Mick Mulvaney's face with clips, and it is glorious. Now, you don't often see this in media in the United States in general, and when you do, it's not usually on Fox News, but I believe that we are in such a desperate circumstance when it comes to proper preparation by an interviewer for interviewing someone that you believe is likely to be deceptive, and to be ready not only with video clips, but with facts and quotes and the demeanor to actually question it, that this is what we have and I want to go through it with you. We're going to look at a bunch of this in pieces because not only is the subject matter important, but it's good to be able to parse it. It's good to be able to understand how Chris Wallace structured it. And there's a lot to be learned from this. And the other thing to keep in mind is this is much more common in British news media. This is much more common in, I watch a lot of Argentinian news. This is much more common in Argentinian media, where in the US, very often with people in positions of power, once they give you the same non-answer or lie 2 or 3 times, you just move on. And it's a combination of not wanting to push the interview in a way where you are at risk of maybe losing access to the person or an administration, combined with the time constraints of corporate media. Chris Wallace does not let it go. And you actually expose Mick Mulvaney as the absolutely immoral Trump brown-noser that he is, willing to just tell lie after lie after lie. Let's look at the first clip.
All right, let's have the conversation. Yeah. Here's my first question. Why did you say in that briefing that President Trump had ordered a quid pro quo that investigating the Democrats, that aid to Ukraine depended on investigating the Democrats? Why'd you say that?
Again, that's not what I said. That's what people said. That I said, here's what I said. I'll say it again, and hopefully people will listen this time. There were 2 reasons that we held up the aid. We've talked about this at some length. The first one was the rampant corruption in Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, Chris, is so bad in Ukraine that in 2014 Congress passed a law requiring us to make sure that corruption was moving in the right direction. So corruption's a big deal. Everybody knows it. The president was also concerned about whether or not other nations, specifically European nations, were helping with foreign aid to the Ukraine as well. We've talked about that for quite a while now. I did then mention that in the past, the president had mentioned for me to time about the DNC server. He'd mentioned the DNC server to other people publicly. He even mentioned it to President Zelensky in the phone call, but it wasn't connected to the aid, and that's where I think people got sidetracked this weekend at that press conference. 2 reasons for holding back the aid.
Let me pursue that, though.
Sure.
Because I believe that anyone listening to what you said in that briefing could come to only one conclusion. Let's play what you said.
Sure. Did he also mention to me in past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
You just described as a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happen as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
He mentioned the corruption, and that's why we held up the money, and we do it all the time. With foreign policy, all the time, we withhold aid for things like this, is what Mick Mulvaney is saying. So Chris Wallace comes back after Mulvaney tries to filibuster for a little while and says, yeah, but hold on, Mick, what about the video where you said it? And Mulvaney immediately starts to come apart.
You were asked specifically by Jonathan Karl, was investigating Democrats one of the conditions for holding up the aid? Was that part of the quid pro quo? And you said, It happens all the time.
Yeah, but go back and watch what I said before that. I don't know if you guys can cue it up or not. There was a long answer about corruption and a long answer
you
about
totally said
coordinated,
that.
just like I told you then, and then I said the exact same thing I just said now.
So he starts to just do doublespeak. And a minute later, after again filibustering Chris Wallace, Wallace goes back at him with more clips, which he has prepared. Another moment where Mick Mulvaney said exactly the thing Chris Wallace is accusing him of having said, despite Mulvaney attempting to deny it to Chris Wallace's face.
And, you know, I hate to go through this, but you said what you said. And the fact is, after that exchange with Jonathan Karl, you were asked another time why the aid was held up. What was the condition for the aid? And you didn't mention 2 conditions. You mentioned 3 conditions. And and let's listen to all 3 of them, because you stated it very clearly. Let's listen.
3 issues for that: the corruption in the country, whether or not other countries were participating in the support of the Ukraine, and whether or not they were cooperating in an ongoing investigation with our Department of Justice. That's completely legitimate.
Not only did you say that investigating the Democrats was one of the 3 conditions, not 2, that you had just said that you had talked about, investigating the Democrats was part of the quid pro quo. You also said, if I may, it was part of the Justice Department investigation into the origins of the Russia probe. But
so Wallace keeps going. And to his credit, these officials count on that if you tell the same lie over and over again to corporate media, eventually the interviewer is going to move on, either because they don't want to get in trouble with the administration, or they want to save face, or they're pressed for time, or whatever the case may be. But Chris Wallace is not moving on. Each time Mick Mulvaney looks like more of a liar, which he is.
Look to the facts on the ground, things that you can actually sort of certify. And what should put this issue to bed is that the money flowed without any connection whatsoever to the DNC server.
You, in your first answer, which I gave, you said that's why we held up the money. First, you just said here that it was for 2 reasons. Now you're acknowledging it was for 3 reasons. If you held up the money for 3 reasons, that's a quid pro quo. You got to satisfy us on those. Now, maybe the president backed off that, but that was the proposition here.
No, I'm not acknowledging there's 3 reasons. Again, let's go back.
You said 3 reasons.
Go back to I recognize that. Go back to what actually happened in the real world.
I love that. You really have to be careful with these guys because they have media training. Mick Mulvaney knows, at least in terms of demeanor and verbosity, how to talk to corporate media. And to come away sounding like he makes sense, even though he's saying A and then the opposite of A, Mulvaney says, I never said that there were 3 reasons. And Wallace says, well, you did. I played it for you. And Mulvaney says, I acknowledge that. If you're a casual viewer, you're hearing Mick Mulvaney in a 60-second clip deny that he said there were 3 reasons for the aid being withheld, and also say, I acknowledge that. Is he saying that he acknowledges having said it, but he misspoke? Is he saying he acknowledges that actually there were 3 reasons, even though he's out of the other side of his mouth telling you that there were not actually 3 reasons? What does it mean? It's confusing. What it means is that he's a liar, of course. Then Mulvaney gets to the disastrous phone call transcript, which of course was not a transcript. It was a few plucked paragraphs from the transcript, which was released. Trump released it, thought it made him look great. It actually was an incriminating transcript, in reality, just a truncated summation of the call, excerpts of the call. And now it really starts to go bad for Mick Mulvaney because Chris Wallace was prepared for the phone call discussion.
In the briefing, you flatly denied any connection between holding up the aid and investigating Joe Biden and his son. Right?
Correct.
Okay. In his phone call with President Zelensky, however, President Trump specifically mentions the Bidens. Do me a favor. Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani pushed all summer for Ukraine to announce it was investigating Burisma, the company that paid Hunter Biden. And a former NSC official testified this week before Congress. John Bolton was so disturbed by the way you were directing people to work with Rudy Giuliani. He said, quote, I am not part of whatever drug deal, he was speaking metaphorically,
right,
of whatever drug deal Sondland, a U.S. diplomat, and Mulvaney are cooking up. No question, you were following the president's orders, but your fingerprints are all over linking aid to Ukraine with investigating the Bidens.
Okay, no, that's not true. Let's go, I'll take one of those at a time, which is the Bolton thing. Because I read that and I was surprised because John Bolton never complained to me about it. No one at NSC ever complained to me about anything that was going on. I didn't see Sondland's testimony this week because none of us have seen Sondland's testimony, which is another story entirely. I did get a chance to read his opening statement when he said that Bolton never complained to him, Fiona Hill never got a chance to complain to him. I think you need to put sort of a...
Wait a minute, Fiona Hill is the one who testified. That's the quote came from her.
Never complained to Sondland about what was happening when it was happening.
No, she complained to her boss, John Bolton.
Who did what?
Who told her to go immediately to a lawyer at the NSC and to complain about it.
Works for John Bolton. Yet John Bolton didn't go say anything to anybody. Doesn't that raise a red flag with it? But let's go back to the first one you talked about, which is the president's phone call. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is really about, right? That's why we're here.
Well, this I don't know about. That I don't agree on. This was mischaracterized. This is another technique, okay? Understand that this is a technique that officials under pressure will often use. It's a sort of Gish Gallop, where instead of answering the crux of the question, instead of getting to the heart of the matter, they give 4 different pseudo-rebuttals to minor points that don't actually refute the substance of what it is that's being discussed, but it appears to the untrained, by that I mean not in a pejorative way, to just casual news viewers who have lives and go to work and take care of their kids. It appears as though Mick Mulvaney has refuted the narrative that Chris Wallace has presented, when in reality he hasn't. The big picture is Mulvaney is an obvious liar. He's trying to suck up to Trump until Trump turns on him, because Mulvaney will be ridiculed in the same way that Giuliani for a while was pulled off the air because it became too embarrassing. Mulvaney now has been very publicly doing lots of interviews in the wake of the Ukraine fiasco. He may end up getting pulled. Chris Wallace was well prepared here. Chris Wallace was prepared with clips and with knowledge and with quotes, and he does something that I try to do when I interview public officials. When I interview a scientist, I go in with my questions prepared to learn. I want to learn from the scientist. When I interview an elected official, I want to go in anticipating what their answers are going to be to my questions and how they may attempt to either distort or not answer. And that's exactly what Chris Wallace did here. And as prepared as Chris Wallace is, still, when someone like Mulvaney comes in, prepared to filibuster, ready to question minor points in a Gish Gallop format, even an experienced interviewer like Chris Wallace can get thrown off track in the moment. And that's something that, unless you're doing interviews like this, can be difficult to understand how it happens. But overall, very solid. Mulvaney looking like the dishonest Trump brown-noser that he is. And we'll be posting clips from this interview on our Instagram page as well. I hope you'll follow us there at David Pakman on Instagram. While you're in your Instagram app, give me a follow as well at david.pakman.